Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this wonderful world of ours, whether you're sheltering in place, you're out and about somewhere in one of those countries that's moving free. We are here today with Elisa Camahort-Page to reveal some of the findings of our RemoteReady study that we finished over the summer. I'm very excited to do this today as we're kind of soft launching. Actually, we are soft launching remotely, a place where we're working with a vision and a plan to make remote work for everyone. And a big part of that is actually this research and understanding what it's going to take for workers, managers, and organizational leaders to actually work together to make remote truly work. Elisa, let's go ahead. I mean, people know you obviously from so many different things that you're doing. Roadmap to Revolutionary is the most recent book, and of course, Blog Her. And actually, as I just learned, a very early student of the digitalization of fiber optic video channels.
Yes, my early tech career before starting Blog Her was in the cable telecom sector and working. I worked at a company that, most of their revenue came from fiber optic analog transmission equipment for the cable signals, and I worked on the brand new, spanking new digital transmission product lines and helped them launch that. So that I have now completely dated myself. So thanks.
Yes. Yes, well, we've been working remotely for a while as well, and telecommuting back in the day. So, I guess just to start, how would you like to go ahead and get it away? Would you like to talk a little bit about the study itself, or do you want to give a little more background? Where would you like to start?
Yeah, so I'm going to start the screen share and make sure I have. Okay. Everybody see that okay, I hope? Chris, you see it?
Yes, we are on the screen.
Okay, good, we're good. So when we started out, we felt like we needed to do some level setting around where people were with remote work right now. We actually started by doing a very small little survey before this study where we kind of got a benchmark of just people, a small group of people we knew and where they were. And gave that, as often happens, gave us some interesting ideas for what to do in a longer study, which is this study, the RemoteReady study. And today I'm going to talk about the key findings from that study, and then Chris and I are going to kind of discuss future lines of inquiry we think bubble up from that. I'm not going to go into long pie chart slides talking about individual data points, and we can provide information like that afterwards, but I'm really talking about the themes, the common threads, the synthesis of a lot of different information. So I would go, okay, there we go. So, oops, too far. So the methodology it's a small study of 194 respondents, and 80% of them were literally people derived from sharing with our social networks. So we knew, and we did get, we knew we would get, and we did get a cohort that was heavily skewed towards full-time workers who already had access to remote work pre-pandemic. Most of them were working from home on a regular basis, many of them more than 3 days a week already. Only 17% had never worked from home before. And these were also folks that had a positive view of remote work already as well. And one of the key things about this group was that their positive view didn't really change. So just to throw a few numbers in there of what this group looked like, 48% were full-time employees. However, 27% of those folks had a side hustle. So that's pretty common to a lot of folks today. And 21% are freelance or contract or consultant type folks, but almost half of those were looking for full-time employment. So contracting may have been a little bit more of a stopgap. 15% were entrepreneurs / business owners, and very disproportionately compared to the US right now, only 6% were un or underemployed. And so, as I said, only 17% had never worked from home before. Of the folks, though, the whole cohort, even if they didn't work from home, 2/3 of these folks worked with other people who were not in their location, who were maybe working remotely. So remote work was already a very common thing for all of these folks to deal with. Also, we had a real skew of about more than half the folks were managers of people or projects, and a little less than half the folks were really individual contributors. So we have a really good mix there. When we looked at the overall group and asked them, what their opinion was on work from home, only 13% had their opinion of work from home go down in the last 6 months from doing it more. 42%, on the other hand, had a more positive point of view. And the vast majority of our respondents said they would like to work from home more or even only. So this is a very pro remote work crowd in general, which I think is a little bit to be expected given that it was mostly shared in our personal social networks, which has a lot of people who have been at this a while and been doing it a while. So one of the things we wanted to dig into early on was, what is someone's ideal working situation and how does it relate to the working situation that they actually have? And we did this in a way, we asked this question, we asked folks to rank, how from 1 to 100, how close are you to 100 being your ideal working situation? And then we asked a series of questions about what the ideal working situation looks like. What kind of working do you want to be doing, with people, alone, presenting, traveling? Like, what's your ideal working environment? What's your ideal working location? What's your ideal geography? We asked a variety of questions around this, and I'll show you some of that on the next slide. And then after asking those questions and sort of trying to nudge people to think about the ideal working situation as being separate from, are you making enough money, or do you have the right title, but do you actually do work you like, where you like, how you like, when you like? We asked the question again, how close are you? And what was interesting to me is that I think people have a very good sense of what they want from their working life. In this cohort, their answer the first go round was, the average was ranked 58 out of 100, which is not great. And then it only ticked down a little bit after we asked these series of questions. It went down to 54. So we're only a little past halfway there on being towards our ideal working situation. So what does that look like? Well, there were really two modalities. When we asked people how they like to work, the alone and focused and in deep thought and creating and sort of that kind of singular or solitary action was the number one response. And you can see there the combination of who chose it as their first and second most preferred style or method of working. But the second most was in groups of people brainstorming and collaborating and doing that kind of creative work. So it's really this very two different modalities, one alone and one with a group of people. And similarly, the top two workplaces that people wanted to be and was home office and then a company office. And I will say in each case, these two responses were first and second by a lot. So the other choices, for example, on workplaces were like in a coffee shop, in a co-working space, at a client's office, nomadically, these answers all came far down the list. And I think it's because those things are really linked, right? When we're working alone and we're trying to focus, we're trying to create and have some deep thought, we want to be in our home office. And when we're in a group and we're brainstorming and collaborating, we want to be at work. And so that was the sort of very two different, by a lot, really a lot, those were the two different preferred modalities that we had. We also asked about where people, there's been a lot of talk about cities and our cities, all the New York is dead, San Francisco is dead type articles and think pieces. And so we asked questions about, would people move if they wanted to? Nearly half said they would not, that they are living where they want to live. And then there were a variety of other answers. I think the second most popular answer was this: I would live between two areas. And so I assume that's everybody's dream of having like where they are now and then where some great getaway place that they could be. And then some folks did definitely say they would move somewhere else. And some folks said they would become nomads and travelers, but those were fairly small percentages compared to I would stay where I was or I would split my time between two places. Now we took the folks who who said that they would move, and we asked them why they would move. And this was pretty interesting. I think it's not too surprising that the number one reason would be cost of living. That seems pretty obvious. But we had all these other options laid out. And what was interesting to me anyway was that it was much more, people would be much more driven by a cultural or lifestyle change that they wanted to have versus being closer to friends or family. So in other words, one of these options is more outdoorsy. One of them is about having more arts and culture. Those both ranked higher than moving closer to friends or moving closer to family. Now, a little piece of data, not from our survey, but just in general that you may not know, is that Americans are not typically very geographically mobile. And that's often surprising, a little bit counterintuitive, because we think of America as being this place where people are sort of on the move and mobile. And yet I think the number is only 20% of people live farther than a 2-hour drive from their mother. So we are not actually a population that scatters. We may not have the living in the same household situation that in other cultures around the world is more common, but we're definitely not going far afield in general. So I think that probably is an underlying element to why when people say they would move, it's not to move closer to family. They may already be close to their family. The majority of Americans are. So I thought that was an interesting little tidbit. So when we look at remote, we kind of moved into a segment of the survey where we were talking about what do people like and not like about it, and how would they convince someone to either come back to the office, or how would they convince an employer to just leave everything remote. And I wanted to say that in our first little quick survey that we did, we asked some questions about benefits and challenges. And it was much earlier in the pandemic. And I think there was a much more scattered response. Like some people, clearly no commute was the number one answer. And in the first survey that we did, every answer that got a really strong positive response was about personal benefit. No commute, more free time, more flexibility, more time to spend with my family. By the time we get to, we did this survey in August, most of August. So by that time, a lot of us have been at it for even approaching 5 months. And there was a lot more universal, every benefit we could think of, people said, yes, I experienced that. I feel like I'm more productive, which wasn't necessarily true 2 months or 3 months earlier when we asked people. I'm more productive. I have more free time. I'm more flexible. I can do what I want. I can, even a question we asked, do you think that teams being distributed makes you have to work a little harder to be creative. You have to think, be more mindful. You have to think of new ways to engage as a team. And when we asked people 2 months in, nobody was choosing that as a benefit. And by now, in August, 65% of people chose that as a benefit. And that was the lowest. Every other possible benefit we thought of was being picked by 80% of the people and more. So we just really were all into understanding the benefits of remote. And so we asked people, how would you make the case to your employer to basically leave it this way and be much more remote focused? And the responses really fell into two camps. They fell into, remote employees are happier employees, and happier employees are more loyal and more, you're going to get better productivity and taking ownership from them. The other was the much more pragmatic point of view, which was just tell them they're going to save money and give them data on productivity levels, and really wasn't focused on how the employees felt about it. So most of the verbatim responses really fell into those two areas. We next, however, asked about challenges. What are the challenges of working remote? And it is a double-edged sword in one particular way strongly, which is that we really like it, but we do struggle with boundaries. We struggle with setting end times on our work. We're concerned about whether our employers are going to expect us to work 24/7. And so that was the number one kind of challenge. People personally said they personally were having a problem with. Now we asked people, what are you having a challenge with? And what do you think companies are having a challenge with? And this is where we started to see some disconnect between people understanding the benefits and challenges for themselves, and understanding what might be challenging for their company. So for themselves, they picked the personal challenges. I'm afraid I will not have boundaries. I will work 24/7. I will have these expectations. And people didn't see themselves. They didn't choose that they are being micromanaged or micromanaged. That wasn't one of their personal challenges. But a lot of the challenges they perceived for the company were all about sort of generalized team. Oh, team collaboration will be a challenge. Team communication will be a challenge. And they didn't really choose the options that were individuals will not communicate well or be productive, right? So there's sort of the I'm not being micromanaged, but micromanagement is a problem. But we did ask people, how would you, if you were an employer, how would you make the case to employees to come back? And there were three buckets of answers there, two of which are here. The first was, I wouldn't. I would just say, don't bring us back, but we're not going to bring you back, but we're going to do more to make sure we're building team and morale. Those were the folks who I think were a little bit like remote work so much, they're in a little bit of denial about the question, which was to put yourself in the company's shoes. The second answer, though, was to make the case that human beings are social animals and they need to share and collaborate and connect. And we do that better in person, and we solve complex problems better in person. And so kind of making the case for that second work modality I mentioned, which is being with a team and creating and brainstorming. The third response, which I didn't put on the slide, but I think it's a funny one that I've heard. And it was it's that for especially women, that working at home has become a full-time, not just working, but also taking care of the home, because we do know the data already tell us that women still are more burdened with household work, with child rearing, all of these things, even in fairly egalitarian households. And so this whole working at home and living at work combination is driving a lot of women up a wall. And I mean, I don't even have kids, and I have said things like, I'm the one who likes to cook, right? I like it. I like to cook, but I didn't imagine I was going to be cooking as much as I am. And, I think I have on occasion said to a friend, like, how did this turn me into a 1950s housewife? And I think a lot of women are struggling with they were already feeling like they were more burdened, and it's only gotten worse. And so the case that these folks who brought this up were saying, hey, make the case, especially to some of your employees, that actually coming to work actually alleviates burdens in other areas and helps them make the case to get more help at home, which I thought was kind of a sad, but I guess I would say it's wryly amusing feedback. So the other thing we asked people a lot about, what do you think it takes to be good at remote work or to succeed in remote work? And what do you think are red flags, which will make you not so great at remote work? And what do you think people need to learn? What are the skills? And what we discovered is that our cohort was generally optimistic. We believe in people. We overwhelmingly, and to a degree I was surprised, overwhelmingly people thought, you know what? People can be trained. People can be trusted. Managers can be competent and capable and know what they're doing and do it right and keep an eye, know what's happening, but not over manage and micromanage. And everybody felt like communication, not identity, was a key driver of being successful. But what I mean by that is we had a bit of a hypothesis, because I have heard people speak this way, that the remote work environment will be better for people who are older versus younger, more experienced versus less experienced. It'll be better for introverts versus extroverts. There are all these assumptions that I've heard out anecdotally about what kind of cohort will succeed. And in our survey anyway, people did not agree with those. The vast majority of people did not agree that those identity markers would be what drives success, that it was all about communication and better communication. And we also see potential social benefits to remote work. Of course, the number one societal benefit that people chose was happier pets, and those must all be dog owners, because I'm sure my cats are sometimes wondering why the hell I don't need more, give them the house to run around in. People also hope for a better environment. And there is sort of a tertiary desire was for there maybe to be more opportunity for more people in more places and locations than is typical right now. Because when we are working remotely, location now becomes not an important factor. And people do hope that that would kind of help with diversity. So those were sort of the main points of view, but there are three primary lines of inquiry that I personally derived out of this data and that Chris and I have been talking about, where I would want to dig a little deeper. And so what I'm happy to do right now, though, Chris, is just see if there are any questions from the Q&A that you want me to answer before we go into this next segment.
No questions have piled up yet, but I think it's a good point to stop and reflect on, kind of what this shows. And, as we've been saying, and it really is our mission to make remote work for everyone, and particularly underserved communities and people who've been left out of these conversations. And, I'm hopeful for these better opportunities for people of color and people with disabilities. But just this morning, and I haven't had time to fully read the article, there was an article talking about how the first people being brought back to work are predominantly white workers instead of people of color. So I think this just goes to show, like, the challenge that we have is that we have to work at it, right? And so have you seen any other anecdotal evidence around where diversity has been improving yet? Or is it still like at the very beginning and it's time for us to shape it?
This is the time. Diversity, like inclusivity, happens because of intention. And this is just my other soapbox I like to get onto, but it's about intention and also accountability. If you don't set goals, you don't set the intention and you don't set the goals, and then you don't have accountability for not meeting your goals, it's very easy to let those, that talk about being more inclusive, it's very easy for it to slide. So what we know is that in this pandemic, it had a greater impact on minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, and workers as far as who was losing their job. We also know that with the remote learning, the burden is falling more to women. One of my personal fears, and I have seen it echoed, is that a whole generation of women workers are going to have to take an unplanned and unintended pause in their full-time work because, again, they already bear the greater burden of child rearing. And for younger kids, online learning is not something they can do unattended, right? So far I have not seen, I think it's a somewhat, there's an opportunity here, but we have to intentionally grab it or it won't happen automatically, is I guess what I'm saying.
Yeah. Shifting gears a little bit, Tammy Belt makes a point that hopefully companies will change their benefits to help remote workers, like their prepared meals, maid services, cleaning, the different things they need to get set up. And we were talking with Tom Collins earlier about the idea of OSHA coming in, or not OSHA, I'm sorry, people with those sorts of skills coming in to help set up work environments, right? So what do you see actually happening so far relative to the perceptions on what changes are going to be happening to create that greater team building or to create that greater loyalty between the employees and the employers while they're, living at work or working from home or whichever language that might be?
Yeah, I think you do see, I think some of the major companies are definitely doing specific things. I've brought up before that my husband works at a very, very large tech company, and his department does a Friday like happy hour online game playing thing together. I think there you see some of that anecdotally happening, but if it doesn't, and I also think here's something I do think the worst kind of lack of team building often happens when not everybody's remote, but some people are remote, and the remote people definitely feel second tier. And I've experienced that myself, and I'm sure many of you have. And the one side benefit of everyone being remote is that everyone's in the same boat. They all experience the crappy video, freezing. They all experience the same frustrations. And it's interesting because our the first line of inquiry that we were gonna talk about, which is not, where's it
I
going?
got one more question, by the way,
Yeah.
before we get too deep into it.
I'm just going to put this up on the
Yeah,
screen so
sure
you
enough.
can see it. But um, that there's this empathy, mutual empathy is the thing I think that we want to sort of explore. And one of the reasons is because to this question about giving different kinds of benefits, I think companies are seeing cost savings dangling in front of their eyes because of a reduced need for offices and other kinds of in-person activities, but they're not seeing that those expenses don't disappear into the ether. They're actually getting shifted. The burden is getting shifted in a very disaggregated way. So my energy bill has gone up, my water bill has gone up, my food costs have gone up because we are both here all the time. And that's just one aspect of it. I don't have good enough internet. We've already tried upgrading to the next. I don't know what we're going to do next. Do I have a good ergonomic setup, to your point about, sending someone in to check out your setup? And so, yes, I think that companies, if they want to reap any cost benefit, and they're already talking about reducing people's pay if they don't live in an expensive place, then I think they need to talk about the costs that are being shifted to employees and giving different benefits that cover that. I absolutely think that that's a real thing that needs to happen.
Yeah, and we've got a lot more to go into this, and I've got 2 pages of notes on the empathy topic that we're not going to be able to get through today. But I want to come back to Jane's question. You kind of started hitting on it on the transference of costs and all that. And actually, I wanted to point out as well, for those of you who might not know, one of the early problems with toilet paper was actually a dual supply chain problem.
Yeah.
Where people were used to going into an office or into restaurants where the commercial supply chain for toilet paper was different than the home supply chain for toilet paper. So the reason we ran out of the home stuff is because they couldn't convert the plants to get the home supply going up. So there's a lot of unintended or unseen consequences that we don't even realize we have to deal with until after we've already suffered through them, like we visited Walmart and all the shelves of all the big stores for so many times trying to get it.
I ordered toilet paper and paper towel from Office Depot, and disinfecting wipes, by the way, and had it delivered in a few days. Like, it was interesting.
Got ahead of the crowd. But Jane Collins has a question. I'm curious about the perspective of huge tech brands who have invested billions in infrastructure and offices all over the world. As we move towards a work from home world, what do we suppose will happen to all of that expensive real estate?
Yeah, that's such a great question. The commercial real estate business is going to be, I think, very hard hit. Of course, I have fantasies of them using all that real estate to house people in ways that are affordable. But I don't know what that will take to make that happen. Listen, they're going to need some physical presences. So even at, so for example, Apple, they have the Ring Apple Park, and there are still some people who are there because of hardware labs. Like, people can work from home on almost everything, but hardware companies particularly, it's very, very hard to transfer, certain testing, certain development. So there's some stuff that people are still going to need physical offices for. And I actually think that I think that many companies are going to try and experiment for a while of like shifts, working in shifts with huge cleaning things between. I think very large companies that have invested like that are probably going to invest a little more in figuring out if they can convert those workspaces to accommodating more people before they just give up on the idea. It's a huge investment, I agree.
Yeah, and in fact, that's really the challenge. And what I've been hearing a lot lately from some of the corporate leadership that I've been speaking to is that they're just now really starting to look into what do we do about this over the long term. We had a lot of early companies who were ahead of it a little bit, who had a little bit larger staff maybe and more budgets, who started like letting everyone, oh, we're just going to keep everyone working from home till the end of 2021 or middle of 2021. But the majority of companies out there are just now starting to grapple with what do we do with all this and how does this real estate affect us? In particular, because of that massive cost investment. I mean, who was it? Just Pinterest the other day spent $90 million to get out of their lease. So, I mean, that's just crazy. And it's a space they didn't even occupy yet, as I understand it, in San Francisco. So that is going to be one of the really big topics. And of course, over the long term, we do see that, there is going to be likely a hybrid sort of structure because some people do need to get together physically in person. The reason for us focusing on the remote aspect of it is because we need to think about how we work with one another, how we team, regardless of physical space. And if we look back at our history and some of our shared experiences, if anyone's been a remote worker when everyone else is in the meeting room, you know that the person on the teleconference line doesn't have the same power as those people in the room. And
Right.
that's not really what should be happening. It should be based on merit, obviously, and other things. So we really have to look at how we transcend space and get to actually how we work with other people,
Well,
regardless
and
of the space.
that brings us back to this one thing to really dig deeper into is how not only, how to identify areas where we need to develop mutual empathy, but then how do you actually help people develop it? And why I say mutual empathy is because this really went two ways. I just talked about how companies, need to appreciate the burdens being shifted to staff and have more empathy for that. We already know that to the scenario Chris and I both mentioned, the empathy towards teaming, if there are some people are all in different circumstances, becomes much more complicated. But I also really observed that people didn't seem to have a lot of understanding of what an organization's real benefits and challenges would be. And there was like this cognitive dissonance about projecting that what the challenges are for companies are all sort of team oriented and not breaking it down to that's because individual workers are having productivity issues, distraction issues, or deadline issues, or whatever it is. So it was sort of keeping it one step distant. And until people really understand, like until the people on the team have more empathy for what it's like to try and manage a team in these circumstances, I feel like it's harder to tackle the challenges and solve them. Really the first step to being able to solve a challenge is to understand it. And I think there's like this little gap there. And I mean, Chris, you're doing, aren't you doing, you're doing a webinar next week, is it, about
No, on
collaboration?
Friday, we're going to start getting
Oh,
into
Friday.
collaborative productivity and what we believe it means to be remote ready. And it really just gets at this heart of this first line of inquiry. And why look, this is actually what arose from the research and what it showed us, what the actual questions were. And it turns out we were kind of already tuned into some of it. This
Yeah.
isn't confirmation bias either, because the way the study was designed didn't necessarily intend to lead to this. But it's really fascinating that what the core issue, why, in my view, why remote work didn't come about more frequently was a matter of trust. That employers and managers couldn't trust what they couldn't see. Is that a symptom of bad management or bad managers? Possibly, as the case might be. But as we start looking at it, it's because of that power imbalance, right? One of the things, Elisa, that you talk about regularly is how there's the people who are known talents or higher up in the food chain, so to speak, have had an unfair advantage in negotiating for this work from home time and what have you. And so, there's very few superstars who get like the ability to work from wherever they determine that they want to work from. Now, as we shift this balance of power back to the more of the individuals across the spectrum, it's going to be interesting to see the dynamic play out because really I see it as having been too oppositional for so long. And I think, and this is my question for you, if I can pose it in a question instead of saying what I think, do you think that that kind of oppositional nature is what is the root of this lack of empathy? And what do you think it's going to take to overcome it?
Um, Usually the I think we make a mistake when we assume that a lack of empathy for another position is an oppositional or a purposefully, proactively, I don't want to understand you. I don't want to I dismiss your concerns. I think it's really a function of, people are pretty myopic and they're very focused on their own concerns and they're very focused on their own benefits and challenges. And um, they don't necessarily know that they're not being empathetic. They're being very, as much as we all talk about how we all have to remind ourselves about self-care, when it comes to this kind of stuff, I think we care for ourselves first, when it comes to thinking about working situations. So, and I also don't know if I necessarily think it's productive to, I think we have to start from a place of assuming people only are not empathetic because they truly do not know. And that's the assumption I feel like walking in with. And so having some, it's that whole giving some grace and benefit of the doubt that this is really a matter of, like, I haven't heard that many people yet talking about this whole shift of burden and cost. So I'm going to assume companies aren't really thinking about my higher water bill or my higher meal bill, and they're thinking of it, well, like, yeah, you got a higher meal bill because we were feeding your significant other 2 meals a day and snacks, but that was a benefit too. I think it was Tammy's point that was a benefit you offered for a reason, to secure talent and to make them feel like they really wanted to come. I also think things may change a lot if we do move towards non-employer attached healthcare. If we do move towards, there's all sorts of societal things that are happening, which I think is, again, it's like this great opportunity to say, what do we really want from a company, and what should a company want from us, and how can we still attract talent, and how can we still set ourselves apart if we're trying to do that as things change around us. Having the bidets in the public restrooms at Google, or the cereal snack things, or the free dinner if you work past 6, those things are not going to be relevant anymore. So how can you, and that's where I say it's mutual empathy, because the companies have to develop empathy for what would really help us in this new situation. But it goes both ways. I don't know if that really answered your
No,
question,
no, I
but
gets it.
to
And
me
just
it starts with, no, go ahead.
um, yeah, no, but actually, I was just going to reflect what you're saying. It really does require you to give in order to earn or get. And so hopefully we'll start seeing companies being more proactive, and maybe even shifting to a more employee-centric thinking around some of this,
Yeah.
relative to how they're listening and looking at the concerns of how do we make our employees more successful. And a
Yeah.
big part of it is by alleviating these needs. Only for time reasons, we've got to switch into the second inquiry so we can
Yes.
actually open up some audio here in a little bit as well. So,
Um, okay. So the second line of inquiry. So this is something that I was really intrigued by. I mentioned how people rejected any hypothesis that your identity, particularly we asked about age, experience, the introversion to extroversion scale. People rejected that as either something that would help you be successful or a red flag for being unsuccessful, and instead prioritize communication. This is something that I think on the surface of it, I was like, well, isn't that nice? People aren't making assumptions. People aren't being ageist in either direction. People aren't making judgments about my work based on my introversion or not. Like, I thought that sounded great to me. And then I started thinking, but like, oh, communication skills is a very soft and squishy topic, and one that also can really be about unconscious bias, because you like people who communicate like you. And how is that not, also something that can really pervert how we judge our colleagues, how we hire, how we review, all of these things. And I started to think that it's very, it's just, I don't mean privileged in the sort of writ large way that we talk now about privilege, but I mean, it's privileged in that, you assume people will communicate the way you like it, and that's what you think will make them successful. Well, put that in the hands of managers and executives, and you begin to see how you get very homogenous teams, because different kinds of people do communicate different ways. And that's even everything from culturally to geographically to what kind of educational background you have versus, all these things. So I think it's something interesting to dig into. I don't know what we would find digging into that, but I am kind of intrigued by this idea that we know enough to say that, oh no, your identity shouldn't determine whether you're good at this. And then we don't think very hard about saying, but just, can you communicate? Well, does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it gets into so many other things we've been looking at for a long time. Those people who are driven by numbers versus driven by story, right? We all have different modalities in which we prefer to communicate. And this all ties back into our line of inquiry number one relative to empathy, because I believe the biggest challenge we faced is we're all going too fast. And we need to slow down and really see each other. And we need to find that mutual empathy so that we can communicate better, so that we can communicate more clearly. We need to stop jumping to conclusions and making assumptions and need to actually ask questions and need to get to the point where we're able to not have a kind of biased perspective on the format that somebody communicates in, whether it's DMs, emails,
Yes.
or blog posts or what have you. And part of the challenge for this is that sometimes it's really hard for me to consume certain pieces of information.
Yeah.
I actually do a lot of mind maps, for instance, and I've worked with some of my brilliant friends, and they look at it and they're like, I got a headache. What is this? Like, please help me. And so I've learned to have appreciation and respect that, like, I just can't give that out to so many people, and I have to find other ways to communicate with them, and that burden falls on me more so than on them. But it still is that sort of mutual component of us coming together and being mutually empathetic. So I really like these two in particular and how they fit one another very well. But I think the interesting thing here is really a matter of language. And it's actually, why culture and all that is so important, because we need to have common touch points for our stories, for our metaphors, for what is it that's driving our values. And that's where customer stories and employee stories can be so powerful, because they transcend all the management speak and all the numbers and everything else to let us feel that empathy for another. And so as we start applying this to our collaborative relationships, there's some really interesting lines that we get into this. But again, for time purposes, unfortunately, we got to
Yeah.
move forward into point three.
Yeah. So point three. So this is something I think every company will have to deal with. While I said that we had this very, very optimistic group and they were very positive and that everyone, generally speaking, the direction was very, very positive, there was in many of the questions about a 20%, sometimes as high as 30%, sometimes as low as 15%, of what I would call the unconvinced minority. They remain unconvinced on all these different things, that they believe some people are not trainable or coachable to be good at this. Some people aren't suited for this. Some managers will, don't know what they're doing and will never know what they're doing. And it can't, this sort of, these are all red flags, and every, you need to work on every skill because they're not there yet. And they're all red flags. And the thing is, they cannot be dismissed, right? You can't just say, well, they're going to have to get with the program. It's a substantial, non-trivial enough number of people that, I think a lot of companies of any size are going to have some staff members who feel this way and who are very resistant. And so I see a future line of inquiry to talk specifically and maybe even do like an ethnography, start with some interviews, find some people who have these really unconvinced, they're very unconvinced, and figure out where it comes from, what's the source of it, and how it can be addressed. How can you reach them? How can you make them feel more comfortable? You can't just dismiss and say, well, then they're not going to succeed in this environment, and that's too bad. Especially if they are current through your current staff, because also people who are unconvinced and pessimistic, they have ripple effects on other people on teams. So you're going to want to figure out how to reach them, how to improve their experience and perspective. And that is something I find it very interesting to think about. And also to me, to do that, you'd want to know, why do they feel that way? Like, what's underneath it? So that would be the other future line of inquiry I see.
Was there any indication in here what it was that was leading to I mean, we didn't go too deep into why the unconvinced were unconvinced, but from the data we have so far, is there anything you can glean that's going to drive that directional?
Um, well, I could go back and try to parse those folks. There was we particularly did ask about what challenges are you experiencing, And like I said, for the majority of people are reporting some challenge. I mean, they're reporting that they have trouble setting boundaries, and they, so I could go see if there was some alignment to some, there is, for I think some folks in some industries, there is a feeling that, and I think our colleague Matt has brought this up before, that if you're remote, you're detached, you're not considered, you're not seen, you're not going to be advanced, you're not going to have, but some of those to me get erased when everybody's remote. Like nobody's got an edge on you if you're all at home, right? So but I know that is one person who is very concerned about how it impacts their career prospects and future, to be remote, and that they lose an opportunity to really engage in ways that would advance them. So no, I would have to, that's why it's a future line of inquiry, because I think it's something to dig deeper into.
Gotcha. And so there's a lot more on this, and it really does. I think what's really important, though, here is to bring in Thomas Vanderwall's definition of trust, because trust is at the heart of a lot of this relative to remote work. And, I think it's a matter of people feeling like there's something that they experience that leads them to believe that, not everyone's capable of working remotely. It might be a one-off. It might be, a pattern that they've seen. It might be their own personal challenges with it. But trust, in Thomas Vanderwall's mind, the way he explained it to me, is a matter of social comfort. How do I feel about it? And social confidence. What do I know about it? Right. And so it is a combination of experience as well as the soft side of it, of what I feel like. And so I think it's looking for that combination of both. And how do we provide that for people? And for many people, as we know from going back to trying to convince people to use social media for business and other things like that over the years, it's a matter of actually seeing it. So it's just going to take a while to get around to show people how it actually works and how we solve for some of these challenges, which is a big part of what we're trying to accomplish. I'm trying to find my button to go ahead and open up the audio, but I don't really have that here. So
I see we have one
there we go.
question.
Jane, I'm gonna go ahead, Jane, I'll read this for you. I find some of the most overwhelming negativity against work from home coming from friends or relatives who can't work from home, e.g. a lot of the healthcare industry and frontline workers. That's a really good point. The stereotype leans towards work from home workers sitting on the couch, watching Netflix and eating bonbons. Yes, yes. And going back to that wonderful TV show, Married with Children, obviously their attitudes are developed from not understanding the work from home experience at all. Will remotely address the communications gap so that more people in all industries understand that someone can actually get a lot of work done and be productive from home.
Well, I think that one of the purposes of developing this sort of remote ready curricula that we're working on is to have it be available to both workers, staff, employees, teams, and management, executives, leadership, and that both things need to be true, right? That a company needs to, and I think traditionally it has been true that companies don't necessarily trust workers to get stuff done remotely. But I think the worm is going to turn in this environment where employees are going to look at companies and say, are you going to be a good remote employer to me? And but when it comes to communicating with people who don't get to work from home and aren't going to get to work from home, if you're a healthcare worker, you're not on the front lines, you're not going to work from home. And I've experienced, Jane, as I'm sure you have, I've experienced this all my life with people who are very interruptive. In the past, there have been people who've been very interruptive because they figure I'm working from home, I'm just available to talk to them anytime, and have no sense of that I'm literally working. So that's a really interesting thing. And that seems like, are we in the future going to develop a PSA campaign, or are we going to, what other ways could you communicate? And we have to, what's interesting is this is totally like future wear, but we have talked about lobbying as something that ultimately that some of these issues around how companies want to manage the cost, benefits, and challenges. I don't know if anyone's really out there lobbying on behalf of remote workers and protecting their rights and all of that. And so I could totally see that being something, although I don't know if it's an immediate term thing we're considering, but I
Yeah,
like it as a future thing.
I wish it could. I did remove the public policy tab from the website before we turned it live because there's, got to get the focus in the core built. But Jane, to Elisa's point, yes, it's an area of advocating for a greater understanding. And then further to that, even the idea of making it work for everyone, I do believe that in the long run, and again, this is something we can't address right now because we have to build the core curriculum and do some of the basics, if you will. But the idea here is to show people how they can make passive income as well, working from home in real legitimate sorts of positions. And so there'll be a lot of kind of entrepreneurship sort of teaching to help people think more like an entrepreneur. Um, and actually, Tammy, I'll get to yours here in a second because we're wrapping up, but Matt actually has a good kind of closing question to hit up on these other key points. So what were the specific pain points or if anything else we were able to conclude? You mentioned boundaries before, and I still see that as the biggest one.
It is the biggest one. I'm going to open, okay, here, I'm just going to open for the detail here. So we asked people, what is a challenge for you versus what is a challenge for your company? And the highest ranked challenges for individuals was more difficult to set boundaries around my time, personal distraction from TV, internet, gardening, personal activities, and personal distraction from family, kids, pets, friends, and neighbors. And let's see, those were like the top three. And then in addition, there were some concerns around, I don't have the best, internet connection. I don't have the best video conferencing. It gets tiresome. I don't have the best workspace set up. So those things are all like tangible, tactical, solvable problems that, you could get better internet, you can get better chairs, you can do all these things. So the pain points are really split amongst those things. But then there is this group a little further down, which is like, I feel left out of important conversations. I have a lack of personal visibility. I have a lack of visibility into others' work. It's more difficult to surface contribution, so there's that cohort there. But when people talked about what they observed in companies, that's where it got kind of interesting to me, that they really were, where is like the number one, the least chosen answer from a personal challenge was being micromanaged or being in a culture of micromanage. And yet it was the most chosen challenge they think that their company is facing. And that to me was just kind of fascinating.
Yes.
And that's what I mean about mutual empathy. Like, what is happening there that, like, that's not my problem, but that's got to be the company's big problem. I thought that was amusing and weird and fascinating.
Yeah, and that for myself as well, I think it really speaks to a misunderstanding of what it means to be teaming. And
Yeah.
in fact, that answer is what led me to kind of label this whole area of collaboration as teaming, in a sense of what it means to be on a team. And in fact, one of the interesting things that I found is even talking to independent contractors or self-employed people, that oftentimes they didn't view themselves as parts of teams. And I'm like, well, wait a second, even if you're just serving one client, that is a team.
Right.
It's the ability to work well with other people, and how do we feel aligned in our objectives and our interests. And so I think we need to develop a greater sense of what that means, and more intentionally so, and more consciously so. And I'll just get to wrapping that up in a minute, but Tammy, to answer your specific question about the National Association for the Self-Employed, it's our goal to really be the resource for everything that works to everyone's advantage out here, to not be a partisan player in serving our mission, right? So I haven't heard of them before, but like to take a look at that. Of course, Freelancers Union is one of the big ones out of New York that's been going for some time, and there's a whole bunch of other organizations. There's even some folks out there who have started the Remote Work Association, and so very happy to support all those other efforts that are out there, because the effort ahead of us is a rather large one. And our mission that we've chosen is an extremely big, hairy, audacious goal, or They use a different word than hairy, I think now, right? Is there some other better term for that?
I don't
Heavy,
know.
I guess, maybe? No, that's probably not appropriate either. But the idea here is that is a big challenge that we're taking on, and it's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of people coming together to look at this kind of problem from different perspectives. And at the heart of it is an understanding of mutual empathy and how do we cultivate more of it, which requires a greater level of emotional intelligence. What it requires is improved communication skills and a greater respect for other people and how we communicate differently and greater patience to get to that point, and transcendence of our traditional views of identity, and a greater amount of respect for other human beings, and particularly respect for other people who are working towards the same goals as we are, even when we might have a different perspective. The idea of agree to disagree and move on is going to be more important than ever as we work remotely. And there's so much more underneath it all. But we've just started scratching the surface of it. And the Remote Ready study that we've produced will be sharing inside of our community for Leadership Circle members to be able to actually see a little bit more of the study data itself, as well as sharing this presentation and this video that'll be available in the next day or so. So we'll be able to share that and talk about this further there through that video in our community. And Lisa, do you have any other clothing thoughts we had earlier?
Thank you everyone for joining us. It'll be really interesting, I think, to dig deeper into some of these issues, and not just, there are many, many things that I think are sort of generally accepted principles about remote work. And those are interesting too, and how to improve upon them. But it's also going to be fun to dig deeper into what's not so generally accepted. And I think we're still all learning. Even those of us who have been working from home for years, it's different right now. And it's really interesting to think about how it's going to stay different and keep different. And so I really thank you for joining us. And if you have any other questions, be sure you can just email me, email Chris, and we're happy to keep the conversation going. And you could take it onto the site too.
Yes, so. And please help us bring more attention to the work we're trying to do where possible. Remotely Global site has been soft launched today. That's remotely.global. And also, for those of you who are interested in pursuing further some more of this research and perhaps supporting it, we've actually launched the Remote Ready Council to start the research to understand what is it going to take to create a remote ready workforce? What does it mean to be a remote ready manager? And how do we create remote ready organizations that will ultimately win the war for talent by being a place to attract the top talent who choose to work from anywhere they are instead of having to go into an office every day. So thank you all very much for joining us for our first webinar in this ongoing series that will hopefully be going on for the next 10 to 20 years or possibly longer, because this era in front of us is an important one for the future of society and for us being able to manifest our best lives. So thank you very much, Elisa, for all your hard work over the past year almost now at this point, and particularly over the last few months in getting this study together and presenting it today.
Yeah. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.